Socialism, taught by the Shao Collective. And the final class will be on June 14th, China and the Global South, Internationalism and Multilateralism Amidst US Aggression, taught by the Chao Collective.
Thanks, and as Satya said, I will be co-facilitating today's class. Just so everyone is aware, this class is also being live streamed. So if folks are watching on Facebook or Twitter, we ask that you take a moment to share the live stream and invite others to tune in. The Party for Socialism and Liberation is organizing this class series along with the Chao Collective as part of our response to the outrageous demonization campaign against China that continues to grow amidst this crisis. We invite all those watching to find out more about both organizations and to get involved with the struggle today. Please visit chaocollective.com. Chao is spelled Q-I-A-O, for more information about the Chao Collective and pslweb.org to learn about the Party for Socialism and Liberation.
So before we begin today, we want everyone to be ready to come out to demand that the federal government cancel the rents on May 30th in cities across the United States. The patchwork of city and state moratoriums on evictions are not enough. In a few months, when these moratoriums are lifted and the rents come due, we will still not have the money. Join thousands of people across the country in car caravan protests on Saturday, May 30th, to demand the cancellation of rent, mortgages, and all debts to landlords for the duration of the pandemic. Protesters will adhere to social distancing guidelines and requirements, including wearing masks that have been established to respond to the coronavirus outbreak. Read more about the protests and find an action near you at canceltherents.org. You can also sign the petition on the website.
Ken Hammond and Sheila Shao will be our presenters for our first class. Ken Hammond is a PSL member in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He is a professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University and former director of the Confucius Institute. Sheila Shao is a member of the PSL Central Committee. She also works in public higher education as an institutional researcher.
So today's class will consist of 2 lectures, each followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. For each Q&A session, we will open up for questions and comments. Any questions not answered during the Q&A session will be answered via email, as we only have 15 minutes for each Q&A session. Webinar participants, please write your questions into the chat. Candice and I will present the questions to the presenters to respond during the question and answer time. So Ken Hammond will be presenting the first lecture on the Opium War and the end of the old order, the Taiping Rebellion, and efforts at reform. Please welcome Ken.
Greetings, comrades. Glad to be here today to talk about this history, which is both interesting and fascinating in its own right, but of course, especially important to us now in an era when the bourgeois elites in America and the West are, ramping up their propaganda against China and creating an environment that threatens to take us into a new Cold War or a new World War. We want to try to overcome that. And one way to do that, of course, is to empower ourselves by knowing about China and about modern Chinese history. So that's where we want to start today. And can we bring up the first of the slides, please? There we go. Okay. All right. This is just our title here, from Opium Wars to Trade Wars. And in this first week, we're going to talk about these 3 basic things: the Opium War and the end of the old order being the imperial order in China. Then as an outgrowth of that, we'll talk about the first great popular rebellion of the modern period, the Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century. And after that, we'll take a look for a little bit at some efforts on the part of the Qing dynasty, the last of the imperial dynasties, to try to reform itself in the face of Western imperialist aggression. So let's go on to the next slide. I want to use this slide to just put us into a broad context. Okay, this is a slide that it's a graph that shows changes in the share of gross domestic product, global productivity, basically, on a global scale over a very long time, but particularly over the last 500 years. And what you can see, and we'll just look at this for a moment, is there's this red line. That's that's China, and all the way down till the beginning of the 19th century, we can see that China contributes a vast amount to global economic productivity, peaking early in the 19th century at about a third, over 30%. While India also was a major contributor for a long time, down until late in the 18th century. We see the rise of Western Europe there going on over a long period of time, but accelerating at the beginning of the 19th century. And at about the same time, we see that dark blue line for the United States starting a dramatic rise as well. What we see there is the history that we're going to talk about, at least part of it, in a very simple encapsulated form. Because what happens at the beginning of the 19th century, of course, is the Industrial Revolution and the dramatic change in global power relationships that follows upon that. That leads to this collapse of the position of China in global affairs, the rise of the West, and that persists over the next century and a half. But then, if we look to the right side of the chart, we can see that beginning after 1950, that collapse comes to an end, and then beginning in the 70s, China begins its dramatic modern rise, while the West, the US and Europe, are now on a declining scale. And this has to do with the victory of the liberation struggle in 1949, the efforts to build socialism, and of course the erosion that goes along with that of the dominance, the hegemony that the United States and the West had established up to that point. So this is just a very, very basic graphic image that shows how things were up until the early 19th century, how dramatically they changed, but how now the world is returning to patterns that are perhaps more familiar or more similar to what they were in the past, as China leads the way to a new era of productivity, a new era of building socialism. And we'll talk about all the sort of fine details of this as we go along. Okay, we have the next slide, please. Yeah, the first thing I want to talk about today is the Opium War. We'll talk a little bit about the background of trade with the West. Then what changes? What is it that makes, sets the stage for this dramatic transformation? And that's two things: the rise of the ideology of free trade, and of course, as I just mentioned, the Industrial Revolution, which gives the British first, and then other Western powers, a dramatically enhanced capability to project military power so that they can enforce these doctrines of free trade on Asian countries and other countries around the world, and then flood their economies with low-cost, inexpensive, mass-produced factory goods, eroding and undermining their domestic economies and creating the global division of labor, in which the colonies and the oppressed peoples are both sources of raw materials and markets for European and American industrial products. Okay, so that's the beginning of this process we're going to look at. Now, the next slide, please. This just gives us an idea of the extent to which already by the 18th century, trade had been developed on a global scale. And up to that time, Europe had participated in this, obviously, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Can we bring the slide up just a little bit? There we go. especially in the Western Hemisphere, the Spanish and the Portuguese had created these vast empires. The English, the French had come in later. But in Asia, whether South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Europeans had found that what they had to do was to integrate themselves with the long established political and economic orders that were in place there, which meant that they were making tremendous amounts of money. British businessmen, British entrepreneurs, and other Europeans were out in the world with their monopoly companies, making a lot of money in the trade in Asia, between Asia, one country and another in Asia, between Asia and Europe. And this went on, this had gone on for 2 or 3 centuries already. But in that context, the center of production, and China really was the most advanced economy, the most productive economy in the world. Most of the things that Europeans wanted were being produced in China, whether this was silks or ceramics or tea or other kinds of manufactured goods. China had a very advanced and sophisticated commercial economy, an early form of manufacturing capitalism. And those were the goods that the Westerners wanted. But the West didn't have things to trade with China. And so they were always having to bring silver. A lot of the silver that was mined in the New World, in the Spanish colonies, wound up one way or another making its way to China for the purchase of Chinese manufactured goods. Next slide, please. In 1793, the British, King George III, sends a mission to China, and led by a fellow named Macartney, George Macartney. And Lord Macartney has an audience with the Emperor of China, the Qianlong Emperor, in which he presents a letter from George III asking the Chinese to open their economy to British commercial interests. At this point, trade could only take place in one port, the port of Guangzhou in the far south. The British wanted ports all up and down the coast open. They wanted to establish a diplomatic mission at Beijing. But the Qianlong Emperor said, thanks for your interest, but no thanks. We are happy to trade with you. We're happy to have you come and buy our goods, but we have everything that we need and we want here, and we really we're happy with things the way they are. And at this point, the emperor writes back to the king and tells him these things. But it just doesn't change anything at this point in time. Okay, but this is right on the threshold of the big changes that are going to transform global relations. And if we can look at the next slide, I don't know if we can. I'm not sure how these appear to people. I don't know if we can make these any bigger or full screen or something like that. Let's see. Things are morphing. There we go. There we go. All right, that's looking good. Keep going. One. Next. 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 Here we are, right there. Nope, go back to Industrial Revolution. The next slide. There we go. So, at the latter part of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution taking place in Britain first, then spreading to Western Europe, North America. But it's the British that lead the way here. And there's all sorts of debates about this. A lot of the capital for the Industrial Revolution is looted from India as the British are ramping up their colonial activities there. Also generated by the slave plantations in the Caribbean, the sugar industry there. There's a lot of money available in Britain, and that is used to develop new technologies of production, in particular the use of steam engines. And the abundant supply of coal, which happened to be located in England, meant that they could take advantage of these technologies at fairly low cost. And this revolutionized production. And Marx, of course, writes extensively about this in the final chapters of Capital. At the same time, and not coincidentally at the same time, new ideas about economics were beginning to take hold, in particular the ideas of Adam Smith, who published his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, advocating the idea of free trade, that basically saying that an English businessman should be able to go wherever he wanted, trade with whomever he wanted, without any limitations being imposed. Okay, can we see the next slide? Now, what that came down to in reality was not the selling of British manufactured goods, at least initially, to China, because they still were not of interest to the Chinese. The Chinese had their own textile industry, their own manufacturing industries in a variety of ways. But the British, who had taken over parts of India already by this time, were driving Indian manufacturers out of the cotton industry and forcing farmers there to grow opium instead. They test marketed that opium down in Malaya, where what they found was that overseas Chinese laborers were their best customers. And based upon that, they decided that, well, maybe we could sell opium in China. They started importing opium into China at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and indeed found that there was a significant demand for opium in China. Now, opium was illegal in China. The Chinese knew about opium, had known about it for centuries. And although they had medicinal applications for it as a recreational drug, it was outlawed, it was banned. Nonetheless, the British began to smuggle it in, sneaking it past the official trade center at Guangzhou using a variety of backstream routes. They smuggled it in, and eventually about 10% of the population in southern China became addicted. Next slide, please. Obviously, from the Chinese point of view, this was not a good thing. Not only was it a social problem because people were having issues about getting the money to feed their addiction, and people were losing their focus in life, and all sorts of issues like that. But the demand for opium, the British demanded that when they sold opium, when they smuggled it in, that they be paid in silver. And so what that did was it reversed the balance of payments, the flow of silver, which for centuries had been into China. Now China starts to lose silver out to the British. That was, a serious disruption of China's economy, the beginning of serious disruptions of China's domestic economy. The emperor, the Daoguang emperor, decided that something had to be done about this. And in about 1836, he asked his officials to give him advice. The fellow here on the right, Lin Zexu, had a set of policy proposals that the emperor liked, and he was made the imperial commissioner for opium, sent down to Guangzhou, where he made efforts to stop the trade, to control the trade, including confiscating opium stocks from British ships as they came into the region and burning it, destroying it. So he was very aggressive in trying to block these efforts by the Western imperialists to introduce this drug into the domestic markets. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Parliament, obviously the British traders in Guangzhou, or Canton as it's marked on this map, were very upset about this, and they petitioned Parliament. They complained to their agents in London, and so Parliament debated how to respond to this situation. And of course, they didn't. Parliament doesn't get up. People don't get up in Parliament and say, "Well, we have to protect the freedom of drug dealers." They got up and they said, "Well, this is a matter of principle. This is a matter of free trade." And so eventually the Parliament voted, yes, we will send the Navy, we will send the Royal Navy to China to ensure that the Chinese understand that they have to be modern and they have to open up and embrace our desire for free trade. And so that's exactly what they did. They sent the Navy over. And of course, this was now, this is 1839, 1840. The Royal Navy has now become the most powerful Navy in the world. It has modern industrial weaponry, big cannons, big guns. The soldiers on board have modern firearms, and this is part of the Industrial Revolution. It's not just changing the production of goods, but also changing warfare, changing military technology. And so basically, for a couple of years, the Royal Navy sails up and down the coast, shells harbors, destroys cities, and intimidates and humiliates the military forces of the Qing dynasty. Next slide. In 1842, the Qing dynasty is finally compelled to sign a treaty, and this is known as the Treaty of Nanjing. Nanjing is a former imperial capital, a city a little west of where modern-day Shanghai is. And the Treaty of Nanjing is important because it does a number of things that still sort of reverberate down to our own time. The Qing dynasty is forced to agree to open 5 ports to British merchants. They're forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. This is where Hong Kong comes into being. It had been a minor fishing village before that, but now it becomes the center for British imperialism, for British colonialism in East Asia. And of course, the legacy of that remains with us down to the present day. The Treaty of Nanjing incorporates something called the principle of extraterritoriality, which said that Westerners would not be subject to Chinese law, but would be tried if they committed a crime by their own people. And it also included something called the No Most Favored Nation Clause, which said that if any other country negotiated a treaty with China and they got concessions that weren't originally in this treaty, the British would get those as well. So it was a way of ensuring that any further developments in imperialist encroachment would come to the British as well. And indeed, the United States, which were the second biggest drug dealers in this trade, signed a treaty just 2 years later, which got further concessions, and those accrued to the British as well. Opium, of course, as I said, was illegal in China at this time. Was also illegal in both the United States and Britain for non-medicinal purposes. It had legal applications for medicinal purposes, but not for recreation. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the Opium War, the defeat of the Qing dynasty, the military humiliation of China by the British was also a great political and cultural shock. And this continued. This wasn't just a one-off, of course. There were subsequent confrontations, further treaties, the ongoing erosion of China's sovereignty and the imposition of the power of the West, of the imperialist countries on China. Other ports had to be opened to other Western powers, and perhaps most significantly in some ways, not just trade came, but Western missionaries and other sorts of cultural intrusions were going on as well. That disrupted China's domestic social order. It caused massive unemployment in areas of the economy where cheap Western goods began to flood in, and people who had been working in textiles or ceramics or other areas were out of a job. People who had worked in transport domestically to bring things down to Guangzhou in the south lost their jobs. One particular group of people called the Hakka, which was a sort of ethnic community in the south, people who had migrated down earlier from the north. Many of them were displaced. And one of them, a gentleman named Hong Shou-chuen, became the leader of what we call the Taiping Rebellion. He had been influenced by Protestant missionaries in Guangzhou. The fellow pictured here, Timothy Richard, is one that we're pretty sure was in communication with Hong Shou-chuen. But Hong Shou-chuen had a vision that told him that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and he needed to lead a rebellion to establish a kind of Christian kingdom in China. And that's what he sets about trying to do. And can we see the next slide? This is the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, which starts out as a kind of rural commune in the south, but after that brings them into conflict with local authorities. That leads to an overall military uprising. They march north. Eventually, you can see on the map here, this encompasses huge chunks of central and southern China. They eventually establish a capital for themselves at Nanjing, the same place where the Treaty of Nanjing had been signed. And they set about trying to create a kind of kingdom, heavenly kingdom on earth. Next slide, please. The Taiping government and the Taiping regime was an early form of popular rebellion, trying to overthrow both the old imperial order and drive out the Western imperialists. And they had a vision of an egalitarian society. It was not fully developed. It couldn't be really in that period of time. The circumstances just weren't right. But they did make a number of interesting sort of social experiments. Unfortunately, the Taiping political leadership recreated many of the hierarchical divisions that were characteristic of imperial China. And that led to alienation between the leadership and the masses of the movement, which allowed the imperial state, the Qing state, to eventually suppress the Taiping rebellion. By 1864, it was crushed, and the dynasty was able to survive this threat. But it was a strong indication of how deeply frustrated and alienated many of the ordinary people of China were at this time. Okay, next slide. So after the destruction of the Taipings, which took a couple of years to complete, there were also uprisings in other parts of China, particularly by Muslim communities in the southwest in Yunnan province, or in the far west out there in Xinjiang, which of course remains an area where there are Islamic separatist activities today that are of some concern, and also in places like Shandong province on the east coast. The Western countries who had initially thought maybe having a Christian rebellion in China would be a good thing, realized that Heng Xiuquan he wasn't a Christian of the kind that they wanted him to be. And so they decided to not support the Taiping rebels, but instead to continue to aid the Qing dynasty, using, of course, that pressure that the rebellion put on the state to extract further concessions from the dynasty. Okay, next slide. In the midst of this, okay, so even while they're fighting against the Taiping rebellion, the Western powers, in this case the British and the French together, launch a second Opium War. There was an incident in 1856 called the Arrow Incident. The Arrow is the name of a ship. And there was an incident with customs inspectors going aboard it, but it was flying a British flag, even though it was a Chinese ship. That led to all sorts of tensions. A treaty is agreed in 1858, the Treaty of Tianjin, to further open ports and further grant further concessions. But the Chinese did not implement those concessions fast enough. And so in 1859 and 60, the British and the French invaded the north. The imperial court, fled from Beijing out to Xi'an in the west. And the Western military forces, the Anglo-French forces, occupied Beijing and burned and destroyed the emperor's summer palace. You can see the ruins of that in the picture in the middle or on the bottom here on the right. And this is those ruins are still there as a sort of visual legacy of this era of imperialist power, imperialist domination, and what the Chinese often refer to as the century of humiliation. The burning of the Summer Palace was an iconic episode in that. Once again, another treaty called the Convention of Beijing was signed. And that further opened China to imperialist domination. The Westerners took over control of the revenue system, of the tariff system, and basically began to run a lot of these things in their own in their own interest. Okay, next slide. The 1860s is a period where the Chinese and the Manchus, the rulers of the Qing dynasty, were people called the Manchus, a different ethnicity, tried to make some reforms. A new emperor came to the throne in 1862 who was not a hands-on ruler. He had physical and mental limitations, which meant that nobles, members of the nobility, exercised power on his behalf. So there was a strong council of what we call regents. And they undertook a series of initiatives, a series of reforms. They created something called the Zhongliyamen, which was sort of the first foreign office for the Chinese government. They empowered, gave greater powers to local provincial leaders, sort of a decentralization, and they pushed a campaign of military modernization. And initially, this had the support of a very influential woman who remained powerful for the rest of the dynasty, the Empress Dowager Cixi. It's a hard name to pronounce, but that's how Cixi is pronounced. Cixi, her Manchu name was Yehonala. Last slide for my part. What this leads to is what's called the self-strengthening movement. And this was an effort on the part of the Qing dynasty to build up its strength in ways that would allow it to stand up to the West. The humiliation that the Qing had suffered repeatedly at the hands of the West had convinced at least some officials, and these are just three of the leaders of this movement, Li Hongzhang, Zhang Zhidong, and Zuo Zongtang, that China needed to strengthen itself. And so they did things. On the picture on the bottom left is an armory that they built to develop their own weapons. You can see them with this Chinese-made cannon on the right. They wanted China to be able to have the military power to not simply be bullied and pushed around and dominated by the Western imperialist states. These efforts would persist in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, and they achieved some modernizations, they achieved some progress, but the self-strengtheners were a minority within the imperial political leadership, and there were other reactionary elements that simply wanted to hang on to their own power and preserve the way things had always been done, who didn't fully perhaps take the threat of Western imperialism as seriously as they needed to. And so the self-strengthening movement, while it had some accomplishments, doesn't radically transform the Qing dynasty, but still leaves it vulnerable to further attacks and manipulations by the West. That's what I'm going to talk about for my part today. I'll be happy. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, and then Comrade Sheila is going to take us on down into the early 20th century.
All right. So thank you for that excellent presentation, Ken. We now have some time for Q&A. So we have just about 15 minutes for Q&A, just because we have another speaker who still has to present. So we have a few questions that came up in the chat. Sure. I have about 5 questions here, Ken, or about 6. Do you want me to give you 3 at a time?
Sure, that's good. And
all right,
try to get through them quickly.
Okay, so the first question I have here is about the GDP graph that you had shown in the beginning of the presentation. So someone asked, where does this data come from? The second question I have here is, so where did the opium, the influx that was coming into China, where did that originate from? Was that from India?
Yep.
And then the third question I have here is, was the Treaty of Nanjing supported by Chinese politicians or factions within the Chinese kind of political establishment at the time? Or was it driven solely by the British and their kind of military power?
Good, good. Oh, those are great questions. The first one's real simple. The chart, the graph is based on historical work done largely by a fellow named Angus Madison, who I'm sorry is not with us on the planet anymore, but did a lot of great work in the late 20th century. Taught at the UN University in Norway, and published a lot of material on global economic history, long-term global economic history going back a couple of thousand years. And that particular chart is extracted from some of his statistical modeling. If you go on to, if you just Google, global GDP percentage historical or something like that, you'll see there's lots of versions of that. And they all basically track the same data. But yeah, that's largely based on Madison's research. The opium that's coming into China is coming from India. The East India Company, which was a state monopoly company that had been founded back in 1600, had been operating all around the Indian Ocean and especially in India itself over the previous couple of hundred years, had begun to ramp up its activity in the latter part of the 18th century and had taken over the province of Bengal, which was the center of the cotton textile industry. Well, Britain wanted to be ramping up its own cotton textile industry, so the EIC did two things. It broke down the existing cotton production in India, which was the highest quality textiles in the world, made farmers stop growing cotton. The English could buy cotton, of course, from the slave plantations of the American South, which they did, which of course further enhanced or exacerbated the conditions of slavery there. That's a whole story in its own right. But those farmers then had to grow something, and the EIC encouraged them to grow opium. And so they had this huge supply of opium, much more than they could market within India. They found that China was a receptive audience, and so they started shipping it over there in larger and larger and larger volume. And it became the single largest source of profit for the East India Company. The East India Company, of course, ruled India until 1857 as its own private corporate colony. And most of the funds, the majority of funds that were used to administer India were derived from the opium trade. So it was a vastly profitable enterprise, okay? What was the third question again? Satya, what was the third question again? You're muted.
The third question was about the Treaty of Nanjing and whether it was supported by Chinese politicians.
Yeah, there was a lot of debate within the political elite of the Qing. There were those who there were sort of three positions. There were hardliners who absolutely didn't want to have any treaty. They said, we'll just tough it out, and eventually the British will get tired and go away, which wasn't going to happen, unfortunately. There were those who wanted to sort of make minimal accommodations, and they're kind of the ones who prevailed. And then there were those, a small group, but nonetheless some, who said, something big is going on here, and we need to figure it out and try to do what we can to overcome this, to strengthen ourselves. Those eventually became the self-strengtheners, but at the time it was that sort of middle, let's make minimum accommodation kind of position that won out. But yes, there were a lot of debates within the political elite. Okay, other questions?
Sure. So the next question I have here. So this is a question for you, Ken. Can you touch on China as a semi-colonial, semi-feudal state? What was it about the dynastic rule that made it unable to modernize quickly like Europe had? So that's one of the questions. I can give you a couple more if you're up for it.
Sure, let me do that one, and then we'll take whatever we got. Yeah, I mean, the terminology semi-feudal, semi-colonial, that's an effort to capture the complexity of the situation in China. China, up until the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, was the most advanced, the most modernized country in the world. Back in the 10th century, a commercial revolution took place. They developed banking and finance. They had the biggest industrial complex in the world at the Kiln Center in Jingdezhen. They had systems of long distance trade, of banking and credit. They had complex forms of capital organization. It was a very, very sophisticated economy. And we always need to bear that in mind, that when the British come in, they're not coming into a primitive, backward economic situation. They are subverting and destroying what had been the leading edge in global development. So that's a big issue. But there is, within the imperial state, there's a difference between the imperial state and the private, if you will, economy. And the imperial state always had a strategic orientation towards Inner Asia. All the threats to Chinese dynasty throughout history came from Inner Asia. The Turks, the Mongols, the Manchus, all the invaders came not from the sea, but from the interior. And it took a long time for many of the Chinese political leadership to come to grips with the idea that people could show up in boats from the other side of the world and actually be a serious menace. And that slowed down the response. Plus, the bureaucratic system, China had an administrative bureaucracy that they had fine-tuned for 2,000 years at this point. It was just very, very difficult for it to adapt quickly. The contrast with Japan is the remarkable one, because Japan in the mid-19th century changes course overnight and pursues a very aggressive program of modernization and westernization. But that's a whole different story, and we can talk about that. Email me about that if you want. But yeah, the ability of China to adapt and to change. It's kind of like trying to turn. You're driving an 18-wheeler, and you're not turning that sucker on a dime. It took a long time. And of course, ultimately, the imperial system was not capable of adapting and had to be overthrown. Okay. Other questions, Satya?
Yes, so there are a lot of good questions in this chat, but unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of them, so I'm picking and choosing.
Sure.
So the next two,
more for now. Okay.
Yeah.
I see time-wise we need to get on to the next stage.
Right. So we have about 6 more minutes for the Q&A. So
okay.
The next two questions that I have are, could you make a distinction between imperial China, whether the Qing dynasty was an empire, and how that is similar to and different than imperialism as we know it today? And the second question I have is, why did British want Hong Kong at the time and not any other Chinese city?
Sure. Let me take that second one because it's a little simpler. Hong Kong was an island at the entrance to the estuary of the Pearl River, and the Pearl River was that's where the port of Guangzhou was located. So, controlling Hong Kong Island, you could control access to the most important port up to that point on the South China coast. It was an undeveloped place. When the British first started building there, they basically were starting from scratch. At first, they just had the island, and later in the 1890s, they added Kowloon over on the mainland. But they wanted it for its strategic location more than anything else. I'm not sure that even at the time they understood quite how important it was going to become as a trade and financial center. But initially, the impetus for it was strategic. As far as China as an empire and what's the difference between that and the imperialism we talk about today, of course, using the Chinese wouldn't have called, they didn't have a word that meant empire. The dynasties were the government, they were the state. And you had the emperor, the term that we translate as emperor, Huangdi, but that just because we use that word in English to translate the Chinese term, that creates an equivalence that isn't necessarily totally substantive, okay? You had a system in which, you had a ruler, a monarch, you had a vast imperial bureaucracy that administered a territory the size of the modern United States. with a population in the Qing dynasty, a population of 350 to 400 million people. So it was a huge and complex entity. But for the most part, throughout most of Chinese history, Chinese dynasties controlled a core area of agriculture. And then they wanted to, have secure peripheries around that. But they didn't project power out into the wider world. They didn't go out and try to take over other people's countries across the ocean or in Africa or something like that. In the 15th century, for a brief period, the Ming Dynasty did actually send out a huge fleet that sailed to Southeast Asia, to India, to the Arabian Gulf, to East Africa. But they didn't conquer people. They didn't take over other territories. They weren't trying to establish Chinese power and domination. They were just learning about other areas, establishing trading relations, gathering information, knowledge. The Chinese have they've never been an expansionist power beyond sort of their sort of natural space. The complexities of the Qing dynasty, it was a multi-ethnic dynasty. It was majority Chinese, vast majority Chinese, but also Manchus and Mongols and Tibetans and Uyghurs and Kazakhs and all these other people. And today, the People's Republic has that heritage of multi-ethnicity. But when we talk about imperialism today, and we talk about the Western imperialists, we're talking about the system under which the European countries and later the United States went out into the world to control other countries, to take over other territories, to make them part of their global economic systems, so that they became providers of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, rather than places that were developing or being developed in their own local interests. So I think that's the best way to sort of make that comparison. Okay.
All right. So unfortunately, that will have to be the last question for this section. But I do want to say all of these questions that we haven't answered are still excellent. So if you all want to reach out to Ken, you can email Ken at let me just pull this up. I believe it's khammond@nmsu.edu. You can email your questions to Ken at that email address, kenhammond@nmsu.edu.
Now we can Hammond, KHAMMOND @nmsu.edu.
There you go.
There we go. All right. Thank you, comrades. I'll be around. I'm going to listen to Sheila's part, and if there's things, in the next Q&A I can help out with, we'll do that too.
All right. Well, thank you, Ken. Next, we have Sheila, who will be presenting the second lecture on late Qing reforms, the Boxer Rebellion, the fall of the imperial system, and the origins of the revolutionary movement. That's a lot to go through, so we'll give the floor to Comrade Sheila.
Hey everyone, thank you again for joining, and just wanted to say that I feel honored to teach this class alongside Comrade Ken. But yeah, I think if we could pull up the slides once again. Now that we've heard about the Opium Wars and really the beginning of what is known as the Century of Humiliation, where China essentially gets carved up by imperialist powers, as well as China's early attempts at reforms, we're going to go into this continual pattern of events of China's struggle against a declining imperial system, as well as colonialism, which leads to the early roots of what we know to be the socialist revolutionary movement. So we're going to go over the late Qing reforms, the Boxer Rebellion, fall of the imperial system, and the origins of the revolutionary movement. So next slide, please. As we heard in the first half of this class, China, which is one of the oldest, most advanced countries, became essentially a semi-colonial state, right? We saw earlier that many Western imperialist powers played a part in ravaging China. Japan, of course, becomes a key player in the conquest of China and will continue to be so up until World War II, until the end of World War II. In 1894 to 1895, China suffered a humiliating defeat in the Sino-Japanese War, which for the first time shifts the dominant force of the Eastern world from China to Japan. Remember, what Ken mentioned earlier, that for centuries, China considered itself sort of this middle kingdom, the great power in the region, with many of the smaller countries around it, such as Vietnam and Korea, that were tributary states to China. So this was a huge defeat where power goes from China to Japan. And obviously, we don't really have the time to go over the details here, but I wanted to mention that other imperialist powers were involved in this war. As such, not only was China forced to renounce its relationship with Korea to Japan, which plays a bigger historical relationship between Japan's colonization of the Korean peninsula, but this also solidified France's control over Vietnam. And most importantly, China was forced to annex Taiwan, which was formerly known as Formosa, to Japan. And Taiwan would then be under Japanese colonial rule until the end of World War II. And again, just like in the earlier slides where we learned about how Hong Kong was taken from China, this is also very crucial historical context in understanding the current day relationship between Taiwan and China. So the 100-Day Reform was a movement that was a response to this humiliating defeat in the Sino-Japanese War. And this short-lived reform movement took place between June to September of 1898. And as we discussed during the Taiping rebellions, right, there was growing discontent and concern over the Qing government's ability to defend China against imperialism. The Qing government was increasingly becoming a puppet regime for the imperialists, and thus discontent among the people continues to deepen. And so the 100-Day Reforms was sort of the final attempt at reforming the system until the fall of the imperial government in China. So Kang Yu-wei and Liang Chao-chi, or Chi Chao, both philosophers and intellectuals, sought out the emperor, the Guangxu emperor, to initiate the reform movement. And so this is a picture of the emperor at the time. And Tan Si-tong was made the grand secretary to carry out these reforms and consult with the emperor. And these reforms sought to modernize education, right? Using science and math instead of Confucianism, reform the military and simplify the administration, and also to modernize the economy, right? They were advocating for things like capitalism. Remember, at the time, this is a feudalist country. They advocated for building industry and move away from the absolute rule of monarchy and advocating for institutional change. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so these reforms would attempt to change the governing structure to strengthen China in an increasingly global world. However, this was a major threat to the Manchus conservatives and the elites and the Empress Dowager Cixi. The Guangxu emperor was under, even though he was the emperor, he was under the great influence of the Empress Dowager. And she still held a great deal of power and had to approve many of the decisions that the emperor made. So he didn't really have full control. And Tan Si-tong tried to further the reform efforts by trying to win over the support of military general Yuan Shikai to the reform movement. I'm going to talk about Yuan a little bit because he plays a very significant role between now and even after the 1911 revolution. But Yuan was a top military advisor in Korea before and during the time of the Sino-Japanese War. In 1894, he was summoned back to China and was appointed by the Empress Dowager to lead the military commander, or to be the lead military commander of the new army. Yuan was considered one of the most important players, really, of the latter years of the Qing government. And it was important for the reform movement to have support from such a strong leader with military significance. However, because Yuan is an opportunist, and is always seeking ways to secure political power, he ended up turning the information he gathered about the reform movement over to the Empress Dowager. Together, Yuan and the Empress organized a coup to suppress the reform movement. Again, I just want to stress here that Yuan has no loyalties to one side or the other, but as we'll see throughout the next couple of decades, his opportunism takes shape in a very big way. Because of this reactionary coup, Tan, along with 5 other reformists, were executed, and Kang and Liang, who were kind of the main leaders, were exiled to Japan. Next slide, please. Okay. But of course, the rebellions continued, and I believe that if there's anything that you probably learned in your history classes about China, it's probably the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was a popular uprising in Shandong, which is a northern part of China, as a response in part to the growing imperialist occupation and the growing religious settlements brought on by Westerners. So Western missionaries were basically able to bypass any local authorities and were exempt from various local laws, which really fed the deep mistrust and tension in the Chinese people. At the same time, we're seeing China basically deal with severe droughts followed by disastrous flooding, which meant basically even deeper economic strife. And the combination of all these events really make the backdrop of this uprising. And just for the terminology's sake, Boxer was a type of martial arts that many rebels practiced. I think some of their slogans or tenets is, anti-foreign missionaries, anti-imperialism, and physical exercise. And the Boxers basically mounted a campaign of violent agitation against foreigners, effectively waging a war against all foreign powers. And at first, the Qing government really tried to suppress the movement, mainly due to the pressure of the Western powers. However, the Empress Dowager ended up embracing the Boxers and asked the foreigners to leave the city as soon as possible and declared war on all foreigners. I just wanted to mention here, she didn't do this because she was a left anti-imperialist, but in some ways she really leveraged and used the popular movement behind the Boxers to put pressure on the imperialists to loosen their grip and preserve her power. She was not necessarily interested in saving the masses from imperialism, but rather exploit the movement for her own political gain. I also want to note here that Yuan Shikai, the military general I talked about earlier, even though he was once on the side of the Empress, he understood that declaring war on the foreigners would be disastrous. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So the Imperial Army and Boxers flooded into Beijing and, besieged foreign embassies at the time, or legations, which are basically embassies, for almost 2 months. Well, how did the imperialists respond to this, right? Basically, this rebellion is declaring war. The Qing government is declaring war on these great military powers. So as a result, an 8-power alliance between France, the US, Britain, Japan, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy sent their own military forces in to defeat the Boxers. It arrested its sympathizers, including the Qing armies, and ended the siege with the Boxer Protocol of 1901. And the imperialists, of course, even though they went in with great military advantage, they still had to fight against the Qing army and fight against the popular resistance behind the Boxer Rebellion. So they had to fight along the railway line from Tianjin to Beijing. So on August 14th, 20,000 foreign troops went into Beijing and relieved the legations or the embassies. And so the Boxer Protocol of 1901 that really ended the rebellion outlined the following demands, which were that China had to agree to pay reparations. Anti-foreign groups were completely banned. Military restrictions were imposed upon the Qing dynasty. Foreign troops were permanently garrisoned in Beijing. The Empress Dowager, who fled the scene, actually was able to negotiate her return by spending the last years of her life as a puppet to Western powers. And the Qing government supported the executions of the boxers, and this included anyone who was suspected to be a boxer. Next slide. So after the defeat of the boxers, the Guangxu emperor made really weak attempts to implement a series of new reforms as really a gesture to try to keep things under control. So then we see the abolition of exams in 1905. We see the consultative assemblies, which were basically provincial level groups created with the intention of consulting about future government reforms, but really the actual participation was very limited and made up of, a tiny elite. There was still no real attempt to grant any real power to the people. This was their efforts to salvage the imperial system and create a bourgeois constitutional monarchy, but it really did not take shape in any tangible way. So now we're going to talk about Sun Yat-sen and the Tongming Hui. So the revolutionary movement continues to grow as the Qing government continues to fail and decline in credibility and power. And so Sun Yat-sen is often seen as the father of modern China. And for folks who know anything about Cuba's history, he is seen by the Chinese people similar to how Cubans view Jose Marti. He was born in 1866 in Guangdong province, but he was able to move to Hawaii to study. And many overseas Chinese people who were able to lead China were very critical of the Qing government and its ability to deal with imperialist powers. He became the leader of the secret society Tongming Hui, which united many anti-Qing groups, primarily made up of these overseas Chinese people. And these groups advocated for basic bourgeois democratic rights, such as education, suffrage, women's rights, land property. And just to kind of bring it back to Marx's writings, these would be considered bourgeois democratic values, which is a process of changing property relations from a decaying feudal system to a capitalistic system. But either way, right, these ideas were very progressive and revolutionary given the context that we're talking about in China. And Sun Yat-sen actually did support the ideas of socialism. Either way, the rights of these anti-Qing groups really advocated for, they were progressive, nationalistic, anti-colonial in nature, and they championed eradicating the backward social customs of Confucianism that maintained feudal class relations. These combined with a program, so basically all of this became a program that unified China, really for the first time since 1839. So in 1908, Emperor Guangxu and Empress Dowager died within days apart. Historians and scientists confirm that Guangxu was, the emperor was likely poisoned to death while the empress died of old age. And then as the days went on, the Qing government eventually lost credibility among the people, right? They were fed up with imperialist subjugation, corruption, warlordism, and increased poverty. These anti-Qing groups organized dozens of uprisings, eventually leading up to the Wuchang uprising in October 10th of 1911. And this was really the final insurrection that led to the end of the Qing dynasty. So Yuan Shukai, which is again the military general we talked about earlier, was responsible for quelling many of these uprisings. But once again, he turned on the Qing government, realized that it was, continuing to quell the uprisings was not going to work, and negotiated a deal with the revolutionary movement players. Next slide. So in 1912, the Republic of China was formed. And even though Sun Yat-sen was officially elected to be the first president of the Republic of China, the new revolutionary government was at a military disadvantage to the remaining Qing government. So the deal that Yuan negotiated was presidency in exchange for the abdication of the emperor and the empress in February of 1912. And after he successfully got them to abdicate, Yuan was officially elected to become the first president of the Republic of China. And then I'll talk a little bit about Song Jiaoren, who was one of the Tongminghui members who were in Yuan's initial cabinet, but he resigned due to his deep differences in governing and strong opposition to Yuan. He wanted to strengthen the revolutionary movement along with his fellow Tongminghui members. And so they created the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, or abbreviated the KMT, which was founded in August 1913 by both Sun Yat-sen and Song Jiaoren. And during the 1913 elections, the KMT nationalists were able to secure a majority of seats in the National Assembly. And the goal was to be able to limit the total control of the president, especially because Song witnessed a lot of this, that Yuan was clearly a dominating power among the government. Unfortunately, Song was assassinated soon after by a lone gunman, and a lot of evidence kind of leads to Yuan plotting the assassination. Yuan then began basically a rampage, a suppression campaign to weaken the KMT, the nationalists. Next slide. So during the suppression campaign, Yuan basically had unlimited control over the aspects of governing. That meant military, financial, legislative. His power is solidified. And each province, he basically reorganized the governing structure in which each province was kind of under the control of its own military governor, which set the stage for the decline into warlordism after Yuan's death in 1916. At the same time, what's happening in the world, right? This is happening during World War I. And it's clear that Japan is winning. Japan captures Qingdao, which was a German-controlled colony in China. And Japan's emergence as a key imperialist player meant that they could make claims in China that other imperialists in the region really couldn't oppose. And so the 21 demands that Japan wanted become kind of this big thing that many anti-imperialists, reference in the later movement. But the 21 demands that Japan wanted, I'm just going to outline the things that they were demanding. So they wanted to control additional territories. They wanted to have control over the administrative, economic, and domestic affairs. They wanted to have Japanese advisors involved in China's political and financial and military affairs, and the right of ownership of land for building things such as Japanese hospitals, schools, and churches. And despite the widespread resistance to the 21 demands, which were international in scope, including Chinese students abroad and even provincial leaders, Yuan Shikai still agreed to the 21 demands, which led to the rapid decline of his popularity and his rule. He then later abolishes the republic. Yuan abolishes the republic and restores monarchical rule and declares himself emperor. All of these events combined, the warlordism, the further imperialist war, Yuan's dictatorship, led to widespread provincial rebellions. And because Yuan had become so increasingly unpopular, he ended up abdicating his throne in 1916, and he died shortly in June of 1916 from a chronic illness that he was battling. And again, all these events depict the continual struggle between imperialism, national liberation, and corruption, and China continues to decline into a deep state of instability. And because of this, Yuan's death created a vacuum, leading to basically a decade-long period where China declines into warlord rule and again, occupation by the imperialists. Next slide, please. Okay, so the public feeling of the national humiliation after the happenings of World War I, compounded by the economic conditions that China had to endure, began to take form in a cultural movement. In addition to the public feelings of needing to defend China against imperialism, at the same time, there were many Chinese people who were living abroad, overseas Chinese people who were exposed to Western education, society, and they really pushed for new forms of governing and democratic values, right? During this time, there was a broadening of the base of mass participation. This is when we get mass political organizations such as trade unions, both a rising anti-imperialist consciousness and the beginning of mass mobilization take shape during this time. People who are a part of this movement wanted to push the idea that politics is not just limited to the elite. The rising tide of revolutionary thought and mobilization was considered, this period was really considered the new culture movement. And many of the cultural critiques that came out of this period, for example, the Baihua movement, which advocated for Chinese writings to be written in a way that's actually spoken instead of classical language. And I don't know if folks here know, speak or read Chinese, but the way you speak it is very, very different from the way you write Chinese. And so in many ways, the movement at this time rejected any of the old traditional order, was kind of viewing anything of the old traditional order as reminiscent of the imperial system. And the new culture movement really had been percolating since the signing of the Japan's 21 demands, and probably even before. The new culture movement rejected Confucianism and traditionalism. There are common themes here among all of the rebellion movements about advancing society beyond Confucianism and feudalism. This was a movement led by students and was highly influenced by Western liberalism of freedom and democracy. But also during this time, we see anarchism and radical thought coming into play, right? So Liu Shifu is an example of a Chinese anarchist and internationalist who was a representative figure of the revolutionary movement at the time. And he had connections to groups in Japan and Paris. We'll move to the next slide, please. And again, because of this deep rejection of Confucianism and warlordism, a lot of the critiques by radical intellectuals of the traditional culture, as mentioned in the previous slide, they saw this as the culture of imperial power and elitism. Just like the classical language that we spoke about, the examinations, Confucianism, and many ideas that came out of this period was about things such as gender equality, right? Against foot biting, advocating for marriage reform. They were talking about things like engaging with issues of literacy in the masses, right? At this time, China is massively illiterate unless you were of an elite class, if you were of the gentry. Mass participation, again, was a huge part of this movement that really hadn't been seen before. They advocated for modernizing education. And you can see as I go through this, like there are themes of just these types of rights that kind of come up in all of even the reform movements prior to it, such as, modernizing education. A lot of intellectuals, radical intellectuals were reading translations of European literature. And this period was critical for the debating and generating of revolutionary ideas for what is the path forward for China beyond feudalism, beyond imperialism. And during this time in the late 1910s, two major events, worldwide events collide that really elevate the consciousness of the people. The first is the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which served as a beacon of inspiration for revolutionary change. For the first time in history, we see a socialist revolution in also a country that was quite backwards. The second major event is the betrayal at Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles that ends World War I. And the signing of Versailles really exposes the bankruptcy of liberal bourgeois democracy and the selling out of China once again. And I'll talk a little bit about Versailles in the next slide, but I'm just going to wrap up this point here. Actually, never mind. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here we are now at the May 4th movement. And the May 4th movement was really a response to, again, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919, which again ended World War I. So imperialist countries that had spheres of influence in China could no longer maintain control, right? These were the countries that lost, right? Germany was defeated. And in the treaty, basically it states that Japan gets to maintain control over territories in China that were previously held by Germany. And so the May 4th movement was a response to this. The movement preceding this event was really built in the same way, the same anti-imperialist vein, just like the Japan's 21 demands. So what happened on May 4th, right? On May 4th, 3,000 college students in Beijing occupied the streets of Tiananmen Square to protest the decision of Versailles. During this time, students were so deeply outraged about the selling out of China that the students marched to the home of the foreign minister, who they blamed for being responsible for selling out China to Japan. They broke into his home and burned his house down. And this is really just to mark the level of rage people had because of this betrayal. It's like, as we've seen, it's one thing after another, like just parts of China getting carved out. And days later, the first citywide student organizations in China's history was created, and Beijing students continued to protest, hold street meetings, and push for boycotts against Japanese goods, all things that we still do today when we fight imperialism. And there were also, even though this was led by students, it also won broad support of workers, right? So what began as a student movement quickly won enormous support from new merchants, industrialists, urban workers. And in early June, up to 100,000 industrial workers in Shanghai declared a week-long general strike to show their contempt for the government suppression of Beijing students and arrests of the students. In addition to the list of demands were the demands for higher wages, better working conditions, and an end to exploitation. So we're going to end here with the May 4th movement, but I just wanted to close out by saying that, today we really covered how China became a pawn to imperialist conquest for more colonies, and how that propelled China into this deep semi-colonial state for over a century of time, battling chronic instability into governing warlordism. And we discussed many, many rebellions and uprisings that took place in China in the midst of colonial rule under a puppet government of the Qing dynasty, and how that led to the overthrow of the Qing government. And so I think, this is a lot of information, historical information, but it's really crucial context for understanding why China is the way it is today.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Yeah, thank you for having such a thorough presentation, because like you said, it is very important for understanding the context in China today. So now we're gonna have time for questions and answers. We just wanna encourage people to continue asking questions in the chat if possible. And let's see, so Yeah, so the first few questions are about the Boxer Rebellion and maybe expanding a little bit more about that. So what would you say is the overall significance and impact of the Boxer Rebellion on China? What was the progressive impact of the rebellion for China? And then are there any similarities between the way the Boxer Rebellion was crushed by foreign military intervention and the way the USSR was invaded by foreign powers? And do you think the foreign powers invaded China because they feared an international anti-colonial movement in their empires?
Yeah, I mean, the effects of the Boxer Rebellion, and let me know if I'm not answering these questions in full, and Ken can also jump in, but I think the effects of the Boxer Rebellion was humiliating. I mean, I think we echo the century of humiliation, but 8 major powers went into China and broke up this massive rebellion. So it was a huge impact, and China ended up having to pay a lot for this. And then the other question, sorry, what was the second question?
Sorry about that. Yeah, so do you think the foreign powers invaded China because they feared an international anti-colonial movement in their empires?
I mean, I think that's a part of it. Of course, I think anytime an imperialist power tries to conquer a land, that's always the fear, is uprising. And so a part of an imperialist project is to be able to crush any kind of grassroots movement. So I don't think that was the principal goal. The goal is to be able to have control over China and loot it for everything that they have, just like any other imperialist nation. But I think that they were afraid of major uprisings. I think a major part of why the Qing government even still existed was that it could still kind of present as a unifying control over China, even though so many parts of China were already carved out for imperialists. I don't know if Ken has anything to add to that, but yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, Ken, did you want to add to that, or is there, no? Okay.
No, I think that's excellent. Good.
Yeah, great. And then another question is, were radical ideas and practices happening across the country, or was it mostly just in urban areas? And then another question was about, where does the history of Chinese migration to California fit in this story?
Those are great questions. I want to say, at least during this time period, it really was concentrated, I would say, in the urban areas, only because a lot of the people who were involved in this radical thinking were people who were able to read, who were educated elites, people who were able to travel to Western countries and read and educate. So I wouldn't say that there wasn't radical ideas in other parts of China, but I think during this time, the most prominent like leaders of the radical intellectual movement were people who at least were educated and were able to leave China and be exposed to these Western ideas. And then in terms of Chinese migration, yeah, I mean, basically the trade of coolies, which is basically Chinese migrant labor, began in the early 1800s. I can't remember if it was before or after the Opium Wars, but it began there. Started, I think the first coolie ship went to Cuba, actually, and then to California. So migrant labor is a big part of the history of Chinese immigration, but also the effects of imperialism.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that answer. Let's see. And then what were Sun Yat-sen and the KMT doing from 1912 to 1919 under national suppression from that regime? Let's just go with that.
I believe Sun Yat-sen actually fled and went into exile during that time. But I don't know. Ken, do you know specifically
Yeah,
what?
the after 1912, when Sun is shunted aside by Yuan Shikai in 1912, um, he goes overseas for a little bit, but pretty soon the nationalists settle in southern China in Guangdong province, and that becomes really their base of operations. So that when um, when China begins to fragment, especially from 1916 on, Guangdong really becomes sort of the nationalist zone. They controlled the local government there in Guangzhou City, and had a lot of presence in the countryside. That's where we'll talk a little bit about this next week, but that's where they established their military academy. They really built up their organization in the South, and that becomes their base of operations.
Great, thank you. And then we'll give you 2 questions real quick. So can you expand more on the link between the first strains of Chinese Marxism and the new culture movement? And then also another question is, as far as I understand, the May 4th movement was a major happening to set the conditions for the Chinese Communist Party foundation. Is that right? Was the movement completely spontaneous, or had any political forces already organized at that time?
Yeah, so those 2 questions are kind of, they kind of answer each other, because the May 4th movement, because people were exposed to Western literature, they were also reading Marx, right? They were also reading, Marx. They were inspired by the Bolsheviks. So I think it is heavily, this new culture movement, the May 4th movement, lays the foundation really for the beginnings of the formation of the Communist Party. So yeah, we'll actually talk a lot more about that in the next class. So I won't go into it too much, but the short answer is yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And then let's see, when warlords fought in China, did they fall out based on ethnic lines, and did they all continue to identify as being Chinese? What was the state of landlordism at the time of May 4th? And then this is kind of a little bit separate, but someone's asking for more elaboration on the Sino-Japanese War.
I don't know too much about the specifics about the provincial divides, but I think it was just whoever had the military control to take control of the province. So it would differ province by province, but I guess I would imagine that provinces that had a ethnic majority, that perhaps it was ruled by those ethnic lines. But I'll defer that question to Ken. But the second part of the question about what was warlordism looking like in the 1919 during the time of the May 4th movement, again, Yuan Shikai had died, right, which left a huge vacuum. So warlordism was ripe. It was happening all over. So yeah, I mean, that was the way China was operating for at least a decade after his death in 1916. And then in terms of the Sino-Japanese War, yeah, it's a little complicated because it also, like other key players, I think, the French, basically what happened in the Sino-Japanese War was that, and the reason why I mentioned earlier that France was able to take control of Vietnam was because China, in a desperate plea to defeat the Japanese, China made a deal with Western imperialists to try to fight the Japanese and maintain control over China. But of course, in order to seek help from Western imperialist powers, they had to make some concessions. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the Sino-Japanese War also has a lot to do with also tangentially Japan's, I think actually directly after the Sino-Japanese War was the Japanese-Russo War. So Japan and Russia going into war against each other, also about the Korean Peninsula. So there's a lot to the Sino-Japanese War. But yeah. I don't know if Ken, you have anything to add to any of that.
Well, no, I think you just touched on the key there, that which is that really the Sino-Japanese War is one step in Japan's imperialist aggression against Korea. That Korea, like Vietnam, had a long historical relationship with China. And just as the French needed to break Vietnam away from China in the south, Japan needed to force China to renounce its close relationship with Korea. And that's really what the War of 1894-95 was about.
Great, thank you. So we are going to wrap up this Q&A session, but just as a reminder, we are keeping track of all the questions that were asked in the chat, and we'll probably respond via email to answer some of these. So thank you for everyone who has been asking questions and participating and watching. And I am going to close out this session and pass the floor to Satya, who will close us out.
Thank you so much to Ken and Sheila for their excellent presentations, and for everyone who asked questions and made comments today in the discussion. We hope you will all join us for next week's class, which will be on May 24th. That class will focus on national liberation through class struggle. It covers the period between 1919 and 1949, and it's going to be taught by PSL members. Once again, I'm gonna go through the dates for when all the next 4 classes will be. So this is the schedule. So May 24th is the next class. It covers the period between 1919 and 1949. It's gonna cover the national liberation struggle. It's gonna be taught by PSL members. And then the class after that one will be on May 31st. The period that's gonna cover is 1949 through 1979. The twin tasks of the revolution. This will also be taught by PSL members. And then the 4th class will be on June 7th, is China Capitalist, on China's socialist market economy and quest towards socialism, taught by the Chao Collective. And the final class will be on June 14th. And this will cover China and the Global South, internationalism and multilateralism amidst US aggression. This will be taught by the Chao Collective.
Great, and just a few reminders for upcoming events this week. Every Thursday, the Party for Socialism and Liberation presents a national live stream forum. You can still view last week's live stream entitled Coronavirus and the Epidemic of Racism in Capitalist America on YouTube and Facebook. Tune in this Thursday, May 21st for this week's live stream. Also, for those who missed the earlier announcement, join us in demanding the cancellation of rents and mortgages in a National Day of Action on May 30th. Visit canceltherents.org to sign the petition, find an action, and read more about the Day of Action. And please be sure to follow us on social media at PSL Web, and visit liberationnews.org for our take on current events. And remember, thinking about socialism is good. Thinking and talking about socialism is better. But building a revolutionary socialist party is best of all. If you're interested in joining the PSL, you can apply online today at pslweb.org/join. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you next week.